The Catskills is an interesting place in America, as it once served as the prime go-to vacation spot for those who lived in New York City. Nicknamed the Borscht Belt, nearly 500 resorts once populated this tourism hotspot. One of them was the iconic Grossinger's Resort, a 585-room hotel packed with all the amenities you could ask for on a vast 1,000-acre property. It was beloved by those who stayed there, remembering the entertainment, the hospitality, and that striking glass-enclosed pool. The hotel even served as the direct inspiration for Dirty Dancing. However, just as the Catskills began to decline in popularity, Grossinger's followed suit. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 78th episode of Abandoned, we'll look into what happened here and how this iconic resort ultimately closed for good, the many failed attempts to bring it back, and how it became an iconic abandoned building in its own right. This is the Grossinger's Resort. Instead of vacationing in the Catskills, Austrian immigrants and husband and wife, Asher and Malk Grossinger, decided to permanently move to the picturesque mountain region in 1914. There, they owned a moderately sized home and over the summers rented out their rooms to visitors from the city. It turns out they liked operating a small bed and breakfast of sorts and decided to move to a much larger plot of land. The couple purchased a former hotel on a 100-acre property in 1918, one that was obviously much more suited for hospitality, and called their new property the Grossinger's Terrace Hill House. With their young daughter Jenny helping out, their property began to grow into an actual full-functioning hotel. By the 1930s and 40s, the Catskills had exploded in popularity. The Borscht Belt, as it became known as, was cheap and relatively easy to get to from New York City. Just like the Poconos, it was an escape from the unair-conditioned buildings and hot, busy streets. This was their oasis, a vast, mountainous landscape to relax during the summers. The Catskills particularly was very popular with the Jewish community within the city, drawing them away for vacations in the mountains with the open and accepting resorts with authentic cooking and lots of amenities. This was at a time when anti-Semitism in America was at its peak, and most country clubs and hotels wouldn't accept them as guests. So a flurry of resorts opened up that did, and Grossinger's was one of them, right alongside the Nevele, Concord, and Brown hotels, all of which were growing at a rapid pace to keep up with the massive tourist numbers over the summer. Grossinger's acquired more land and continued to open more amenities up. In fact, Grossinger's boasted an impressive list with a golf course, tennis court, a theater, indoor and outdoor swimming pools, a 1,300-seat dining room, and even an airstrip. The resort was so big that it had its own postal code. With the massive feasts they would cook up daily and the genuine luxury offered here, Grossinger's was a massive draw for the area and a destination truly revered by so many. The resort offered a laid-back and relaxing atmosphere while also keeping guests busy with their myriad of daily activities.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Here are a few suggestions for your afternoon's entertainment. At 2:45 this afternoon, on the Grossinger ball field, our weekly guest staff baseball game will take place. And at 3 o'clock up at the Grossinger golf course, golf pro Joe Tenesa will give another of his group golf lessons.
The resort was immensely successful, so much so that the Grossinger family opened up another hotel on Miami Beach in 1939. It was later rebranded in the mid-1940s, but the structure still stands today as the SLS South Beach. Back in New York though, from the 1950s through the 70s, the property was seeing over 150 to 300,000 visitors a year, and Grossinger's became the second largest hotel in America. The property hosted a few notable figures too, from Rocky Marciano, who trained on the resort grounds, to the countless entertainers who performed in Grossinger's nightclub, like Jerry Lewis, Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth Taylor, and many more. Politicians would speak to massive crowds in front of the towering Tudor-style buildings. It was truly a prestigious resort, and one that felt like it could never fail, at least certainly not in what seemed to be the golden years for the property. Jenny Grossinger had been in charge through this whole expansion period, overseeing the transformation of what would become the luxury getaway they would be known for. Jenny had become sort of a celebrity in her own right, known for her philanthropy and success as a woman in business. However, sadly, at the age of 80, she had passed away on the resort's property. While ownership was passed down to her son Paul, many saw this as a turning point for the hotel. But at a much larger scale, it was sort of a turning point for the Catskills as a whole. All of the primary reasons that drove people out to the mountains had been changing over the last few years. Homes in the cities now had air conditioning, gambling was now legal in nearby Atlantic City, and private summer homes were becoming popular for the upper middle class. But the real big change here was air travel. With affordable and fast transportation, people were now choosing to spend their holidays in more exotic locations. They had options now, and many opted to try something new. Whatever the case may be, guest numbers had declined severely, and the area rapidly became oversaturated with resorts. Grossinger's had a truly enormous amount of land to take care of, with enough buildings to match the square footage of a small town. That was a lot to look after, most of which were built in the 20s and 30s. Operating expenses were high, and with the number of paying guests on the decline, well, that was rather worrying. Through the 1980s, the property was struggling. Repair bills were piling up, and the building was starting to become neglected. With less than 50,000 people visiting the resort per year, the resort had lost nearly $2 million by 1984. Paul Grossinger, seemingly tired of dealing with the constant headaches and perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, decided to check out himself. He sold the entire property to a group of investors who formed Grossinger Associates. They brought in a hospitality service company called Servco. They were one of the largest independent hotel operators in America, running around 90 properties in various sizes, though none of them at the scale of Grossinger's. The deal went through in late 1985 with a sale price of $9 million, or $25 million today. The sale was a big deal, even making the front page of the New York Times, and the project was promising news for those who held the resort in high regard. By the following year, in 1986, the resort had closed its doors. But this was only going to be temporary, as the new owners got right to work, demolishing some of the smaller buildings. Their plan was to invest $20 million and utilize more of the 800-acre property. First, with renovating the main hotel and building out more than 2,000 condos around the lake. This was sort of a popular trend at the time, building small condo units in the former hotels, the Browns being a great example of such a conversion. But this was going to be a mix of a hotel and a condo facility, a truly full-service luxury destination to stay for the night or live your best life. Servco would later buy into this vision with their own equity stake in the project. In the meantime, the hit film Dirty Dancing had been released, with screenwriter Eleanor Bergstein recalling her time dancing at Grossinger's, ultimately writing the film in part around her experience at the resort. While the film does take place in the Catskills, none of the actual movie was filmed there, since after all, the hotel was under construction and anticipating a quick reopening. The newly named Grossinger's Hotel and Spa was slated to reopen in 1988. This timeline, though, would turn out to be a bit optimistic. Work began on the renovations in the lobby, building out a new structure, gutting the interior, and framing new drywall. But the $20 million budget then suddenly ballooned to $30 million. Work hadn't even begun on the condos, and the hotel renovations had slowed to a crawl. In 1988, despite local newspapers claiming the resort was ready to open that spring, the reality was Grossinger's was too far gone. The cost associated with getting the property back up to an acceptable level of what they would charge was just too great of a cost. Even if they did reopen for the summer, they would only lose money. Grossinger Associates, the primary stakeholder for the property, were also deep in a hole, declaring bankruptcy in 1990, owing more than $40 million to their creditors. So, in order to pay them back, they were forced to sell the half-finished resort. Grossinger's was sold in 1993 for $5 million to a Korean businessman who took great interest in the golf aspect of the business. Since the 1985 sale, the golf course and the club associated actually remained open, it being the only source of income for the property, and the new owner, Song Ki-min, had promised to expand the course into what he called world-class caliber. While money was invested into it, he also promised to reopen the hotel. In fact, he actually did. A small portion of the hotel wing that connected to the indoor pool was actually reopened, but very informally. Only around 40 rooms were active, mainly for golf players, and with ununiformed staff and the rest of the resort pretty much appearing abandoned, this budget attempt to reopen was a bit of a failure. Ultimately, the hotel closed down once again, and any long-term plans with Song Ki-min had been dropped. He declared bankruptcy, and once again, the property went to auction in 1999. Louis Capelli, a developer with big ambitions for the site, had purchased the land for $6 million. He did so along with the nearby and also defunct Concord Hotel. Capelli and his investors purchased the two properties with plans for a $150 million development slated to demolish both hotels and rebuild them as new luxury resorts with destination spas. By this point, Grossinger's was in rough condition. The grounds were overgrown, and the former rooms were ghostly reminders of the past. Moss had begun growing on the tiled floor inside the indoor pool, while mold consumed the drywall in the unfinished lobby. This was all while Louis Capelli claimed that deals and financing for the project had fallen through, with claims that the state's promise of casino permissions were also not working out. The only development he had to show for was the demolition of the Concord. Other than that, Grossinger's was still standing, and nothing seemed to be moving. Through the early 2000s, the resort continued to rot away. Meanwhile, the state had introduced a controversial bill, essentially planning to grant permission to certain development proposals for casino licenses. The Nevele Resort was one of the strongest cases for one, but if you watched my video on that resort, you'll know that didn't exactly go to plan. Even with Governor Andrew Cuomo and strong support declaring this as the best way to bring tourism back to the Catskills, movement was very slow.
We had the Concord, we had Kutcher's, we had the Nevele. We just need something to be an engine to turn that switch again. And it's casinos. We've been talking about it for decades, and nothing happened.
This was in 2013, and people were now finding their way inside Grossinger's labyrinth of abandoned buildings. Graffiti now covered the most iconic building of the property, the massive indoor swimming pool. Mold had now taken over almost every corner of the structure, and decades of decay had made certain amenities at the resort nearly unrecognizable. The property was in terrible shape, and the more its story was shared locally, the more the structure was just destroyed. This was aided by the fact there was no security on the property, and for the owners, well, it didn't seem to matter much since their plans were to erase it from the landscape anyways. In fact, movement on that front was finally made in 2017, when Sullivan Resorts, a subsidiary LLC under Louis Capelli's ownership, applied for state help to clean up the site. This started with the closure of the golf course in 2017, and soon after, the demolition of the former resort. Through the summer, crews worked to take down the distinct Tudor Lodge buildings, the towering hotel structures, and ultimately the unfinished lobby and the well-known indoor pool. By the end of 2018, the iconic Grossinger's Resort and the equally iconic abandoned location had officially been wiped off the map. Just a few buildings, the roads, and the holes at the golf course remained. In early 2019, following the $6 million demolition efforts, Sullivan Resorts announced their intentions to build a $50 million 250-room hotel resort, packed with a spa, reinvigorated golf course, and once again, condos. Doesn't that sound a bit familiar? This announcement was made with no concept art and barely any details past their flashy statistics. Other than the fact that $50 million is certainly not enough to construct anything at that caliber, we haven't heard anything since. But what we have heard from are the guests who remember Grossinger's, the memories and the lifelong relationships made there. With a property this old, it's bound to have a colorful history, and the legacy it holds today is in legendary status as one of the greatest hotels in America. Certainly a transformative one, especially for the American Jewish community. But it also holds legendary status for what it became. It's rare to see a property at this scale sit abandoned for so long. And of course, there were people to document the changes along the way. Notably Joe Lehman, the son of a Servco executive in charge of the Grossinger's development. And as a child, he literally lived in the abandoned resort through the late 1980s. He documented the changes through the following decades, and much of his archival photography has been shown in this video. Today, the site sits as a pile of rubble and a rough landscape with just a few reminders of the past, but not many. The remaining structure on the land burned down in the summer of 2022 from suspected arson. That essentially finishes off the physical story of Grossinger's, a hotel built in the early 1900s, open for 67 years, becoming something truly special for so many. From that point, the change of the surroundings and simple economics kept it closed and abandoned for a remarkable 32 years. As for the future, well, really who knows what's going to happen here. Everyone makes it seem like a casino is the only way to revive this area, and maybe they're right. But I think people would really like to see something that harkens back to an era that most of us really miss. A peaceful and relaxing way to spend the summer, and something that makes you feel welcomed and cared for. Maybe something that invokes the very special feeling of being at Grossinger's. If you're interested in supporting my videos further, my Patreon page is the perfect place to go to get exclusive perks like early video access, usually a week before it goes live here on YouTube, as well as Polaroids, merch, and much more. Go to patreon.com/BrightSunFilms. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.